What did it truly mean to grow old in the 14th century? What horrors did the twilight years of medieval life present to its most vulnerable? What terrifying threats lurked around every corner for those past their prime, day after day from 1000 to 1500 C? Number 1. The looming specter of disease and the desperate search for cure. Life in the medieval world was a constant battle against unseen enemies, particularly for those whose bodies had weathered decades of toil. The very air seemed to harbor contagions. The water held microscopic menaces, and the ground itself teemed with the potential for illness. For seniors, a weakened constitution meant every sniffle could escalate, every wound could turn fatal. A simple fever, for a younger person, might pass within days. For a grandparent, it could be a swift descent into delirium and death. The understanding of disease was rooted in ancient Greek theories, primarily the concept of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was seen as an imbalance of these vital fluids. A physician, if one was even accessible, would largely rely on observing symptoms and then attempting to restore balance through often drastic means. Bloodletting was a common practice, believed to remove excess blood, which was thought to cause inflammation or fever. A senior with a frail pulse and already low vitality might find this treatment more debilitating than the illness itself. Leeches were applied to draw out bad blood, or a vein might be cut directly, allowing pints of vital fluid to drain into a bowl. A person already weakened by age, perhaps suffering from anemia, could easily succumb to this drastic intervention. Alongside bloodletting, purging was frequent. Vomiting or diarrhea were induced through powerful emetics and laxatives derived from herbs or minerals, aiming to expel toxins from the body. For an older person, this could lead to severe dehydration and electrolyte imbalance, making their condition worse. They might already suffer from poor digestion, and such treatments would add another layer of stress to their systems. Herbal remedies were widespread, passed down through generations, often administered by local wise women or monastic apothecaries. Some herbs, like willow bark for pain relief or chamomile for calming, held genuine therapeutic properties. But many others were based on superstition or misinformation. The wrong dosage or combination could be toxic, especially for an elderly body with less resilience. Consider the pervasive threat of common infections. A simple cut, a scrape from daily work, could fester into a life-threatening infection without antibiotics. Erysipelas, often called St. Anthony's fire, was a bacterial skin infection that would spread rapidly, causing intense pain, swelling, and fever. For a senior with compromised circulation or a weaker immune response, this could lead to widespread cellulitis, gangrene, and eventually sepsis. Medieval texts described horrific cases, with the skin turning black and peeling away. Amputation was a last resort, performed without anesthesia or sterile conditions, nearly a death sentence for an older individual. Dysentery, or the bloody flux, was another constant menace. Lack of proper sanitation meant contaminated water sources were common. Villages often drew water from the same rivers, into which human and animal waste flowed. For seniors, the severe dehydration and electrolyte loss caused by dysentery could quickly lead to collapse. The loss of appetite and inability to retain nutrients compounded pre-existing nutritional deficiencies, leaving them utterly depleted. Outbreaks of dysentery were frequent, especially in crowded towns or during sieges, affecting all age groups but striking down the frailest with relentless efficiency. Tuberculosis, known as consumption, slowly wasted away its victims. Its symptoms, chronic cough, fever, night sweats, and weight loss, would mimic the general decline associated with old age, often delaying proper identification. For an older person, already struggling with reduced lung capacity or other respiratory issues, the disease would relentlessly destroy their lungs, leaving them gasping for breath. The slow, debilitating nature of consumption meant a prolonged period of suffering, making the individual a heavy burden on their family, if they had one, or condemning them to a solitary, agonizing end. Then came the catastrophic epidemics. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, stands as a chilling testament to the medieval world's vulnerability. While it spared no age group, older individuals, particularly those already battling chronic conditions or malnutrition, were highly susceptible. The bubonic form of the plague caused agonizing swellings, high fevers, and internal hemorrhaging. The pneumonic form attacked the lungs directly, spreading through airborne droplets. For a senior, the sudden onset and rapid progression of the plague meant there was little time for anyone to react. Entire families could be wiped out within days, leaving no one to care for the remaining elderly. Villages lost a third, a half, or even more of their population. A senior who survived the initial onslaught faced a world irrevocably altered, often losing all their kin and support networks, leaving them isolated and destitute. Smallpox was another recurrent killer. Survivors of smallpox were often left disfigured with deep scars or blind. For a senior, contracting smallpox meant a high probability of death due to weakened immunity. Even if they survived, the debilitating effects, like blindness or severe scarring, would significantly impair their ability to function and find support. The medieval world had no concept of vaccination, so each generation was vulnerable to these outbreaks. A senior's daily life was filled with these silent threats. The chill of a damp, unheated home during winter could bring on pneumonia. A lingering cough from a cold could escalate into bronchitis or other severe respiratory infections. Poor dental hygiene was widespread, leading to tooth decay, abscesses, and gum infections. For an older person, the loss of teeth meant difficulty chewing, limiting their already meager diet, leading to further malnutrition and susceptibility to illness. An abscessed tooth, untreated, could spread infection throughout the jaw and even into the bloodstream, a silent killer. Hospitals in the medieval period were not places of healing in the modern sense. They were primarily hospices, charitable institutions run by monastic orders or wealthy patrons focused more on spiritual care and providing shelter for the sick, the poor, and the elderly. Basic nursing care was offered, but sophisticated medical treatments were absent. A senior taken to such a place might find warmth and food, but little in the way of effective medical intervention for a serious illness. The limited numbers of such institutions also meant that many sick and elderly individuals simply perished in their homes or on the streets, without any form of institutional care. The overwhelming presence of death meant that medieval communities, and especially the elderly within them, lived under a constant, pervasive shadow of illness, with little hope of cure. Number 2. The constant gnawing threat of famine and malnutrition. The medieval senior lived with the perpetual dread of an empty stomach, a fear far more tangible and immediate than any spiritual torment. Food security was a fragile concept, constantly teetering on the brink of collapse due to factors entirely beyond human control or even understanding. For an older person whose body required regular sustenance to maintain strength and ward off illness, the periods of scarcity were especially brutal, often pushing them beyond the point of recovery. Agriculture was the backbone of medieval society, but it was a system prone to devastating failures. Crop yields were low by modern standards, highly dependent on favorable weather. A prolonged drought in spring could stunt the growth of essential grains like wheat, barley, and oats. Excessive rains during harvest could lead to waterlogged fields, rotting crops, and widespread mold. A severe frost could destroy newly planted seeds. Any one of these climatic events could trigger a localized famine, and a combination could lead to a widespread hunger crisis across entire regions. When the harvest failed, the prices of what little food remained would skyrocket, putting it far out of reach for the majority of the population, especially the elderly poor. A senior living on a fixed income, perhaps a small pension from a lord if they were fortunate, or relying on the charity of their family or community, would find their purchasing power vanish. The decision became stark. Purchase a tiny portion of expensive, often poor quality grain, or starve. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 serves as a stark historical example. Triggered by years of unusually heavy rainfall, it led to widespread crop failures across much of northern Europe. Food became incredibly scarce. People ate whatever they could find. Roots, weeds, bark, and even animals typically avoided, like dogs and cats. For older individuals, whose digestive systems might already be less robust, consuming such meager and unusual fare would cause severe digestive distress, leading to malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies, and dysentery. Their weaker bodies would rapidly deplete their reserves. Many died not directly from starvation, but from diseases that their weakened bodies could no longer fight off. The famine devastated entire communities, and older individuals who often had fewer physical resources or labor capacity to contribute were frequently the first to succumb. Even in years of plenty, the medieval diet was often nutritionally inadequate, especially for the poor. It revolved heavily around cereals, primarily bread made from coarse grains. Meat was a luxury for most, reserved for feast days or for the wealthy. Vegetables were limited to what could be grown locally and seasonally. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots were common, as were cabbage and beans. Fruits were also seasonal and often perishable. For an older person, chewing hard, dense bread could be a challenge, especially with typical medieval dental issues. Many seniors likely suffered from tooth decay and tooth loss, making it difficult to consume the primary dietary staples. This reliance on grains meant deficiencies in essential vitamins and minerals were common. Scurvy, caused by a lack of vitamin, etc., would lead to bleeding gums, bruising, and joint pain, a debilitating condition for anyone, but especially an older person already suffering from stiff joints. Rickets, caused by a lack of vitamin D, would weaken bones, making older individuals even more susceptible to fractures from falls. Anemia due to iron deficiency was widespread, causing chronic fatigue and weakness. Making daily tasks incredibly difficult for a senior. Storage of food was another challenge. Without refrigeration, food spoilage was a constant concern. Grains could be infested by weevils or mold. Meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried, which altered its nutritional content and made it less palatable. Vegetables and fruits could only be preserved for a limited time through pickling or drying. A senior relying on stored provisions from the previous harvest faced the risk of consuming contaminated or nutritionally degraded food, contributing to illness. Moreover, the elderly often had reduced physical capacity for labor. In an agrarian society, physical strength was directly linked to the ability to secure food. A senior might no longer be able to work the fields, herd livestock, or participate in heavy communal tasks. This reduction in their economic value could place them in a precarious position within their family or community. While some were cared for out of familial duty or respect for their wisdom, others could become a burden, leading to reduced food allocation within the household. An older parent might watch their grandchildren eat, receiving only the scraps or the less nutritious portions. The threat of famine also impacted senior women disproportionately. A widowed older woman without a male head of household or adult children to support her, could quickly fall into destitution. She might resort to begging or relying on patchy charitable alms from the church or wealthy benefactors. These forms of support were rarely sufficient to provide consistent nourishment. Her physical weakness would prevent her from competing for food with younger, stronger beggars. Even when food was available, its preparation and sanitation were poor. Cooking often took place over open fires, leading to smoke inhalation. Contaminated water used for cooking could spread disease. Food was often handled without proper hygiene. The lack of variety and consistent access to nutrient-rich foods meant that medieval seniors rarely experienced true robust health, even in good times. Their bodies were constantly running on a low battery, leaving them vulnerable to any additional stress, be it illness, cold, or injury. The daily act of finding enough to eat and ensuring it was safe to consume was a relentless struggle for survival that wore down the body and the spirit. The memory of past famines and the ever-present possibility of the next hung over their daily lives, a constant reminder of their precarious existence. Number 3. The harsh reality of violence, crime, and the perils of war. For medieval seniors, the world was often a dangerous place, not just from unseen pathogens or crop failures, but from the direct actions of their fellow humans. The absence of strong central authorities, the prevalence of feudal rivalized banditry, meant that violence was a daily possibility, one that older individuals less able to defend themselves were uniquely vulnerable to. Rural areas were particularly susceptible to brigandage. Bands of robbers, often desperate former soldiers or peasants driven to crime by poverty, roamed the countryside. They preyed on isolated farms, travelers, and small villages. For a senior living alone on a farm or traveling to market, an encounter with such a group could mean not just the loss of their meager possessions, but severe physical assault or even death. They might be specifically targeted because their perceived weakness made them an easy mark, less likely to resist or escape. The stories of such attacks would spread through communities, fostering a constant sense of fear and insecurity among the elderly. Feudal warfare, though often small-scale compared to modern conflicts, was a recurring disruption. Lords constantly feuded over land, resources, or honor. These skirmishes rarely involved massive armies, but consisted of raids by armed retainers on rival territories. Villages and farms in the path of such conflicts were often plundered. Crops were burned, livestock was stolen, and homes were set alight. For an elderly resident, fleeing their home might be impossible due to physical infirmity. They could be caught in the crossfire or left to face the wrath of victorious soldiers who might loot their property, or worse. An older person might also be left behind as others fled, seen as too slow or too much of a burden, facing an uncertain fate at the hands of the raiders. The lack of effective law enforcement meant that justice was often localized and brutal. In many areas, the lord of the manor held judicial power, and justice could be swift but not always fair. In urban areas, watchmen were often few and ineffective, especially after dark. Crime rates, particularly theft and assault, were high. An older person, perhaps, carrying their weekly earnings from meager labor or traveling with goods to sell, was an attractive target for urban criminals. They might be robbed of their lifeline, leaving them destitute or physically harmed in the process. A broken bone, for a senior in the medieval period, was not a minor inconvenience, but a potentially life-ending injury due to the lack of proper medical care and the prolonged recovery time. Beyond direct violence, older individuals were vulnerable to more subtle forms of exploitation. A senior living alone might be swindled out of their small plot of land or their savings by unscrupulous neighbors or relatives. Without legal protections or the physical capacity to resist, they could be dispossessed, forced into beggary. The legal system, complex and often expensive, was largely inaccessible to the poor and elderly. Even within families, while care for the elderly was generally expected, it was not always a given. Disputes over inheritance could lead to neglect or outright abuse. An older parent might find themselves sidelined, their wishes ignored, or their resources appropriated by younger, stronger family members. If they were seen as a burden, their treatment could deteriorate, leading to a slow and silent form of violence through deprivation and isolation. The construction of medieval settlements themselves spoke to the pervasive threat of violence. Villages often had defensive ditches or palisades. Towns were surrounded by massive walls, their gates locked at night. Castles, the strongholds of the powerful, were designed for defense against invaders. While these structures offered some protection, they also reflected the constant fear of external threat. For the elderly, the process of fleeing to safety within a town wall during an alarm or climbing stairs within a castle presented significant physical challenges. Large-scale warfare, though less frequent than localized feuds, brought even greater dangers. The 100 Years' War, spanning over a century, saw English and French armies along with their allies and mercenaries crisscross vast swaths of land. Armies on the march lived off the land, requisitioning food and supplies from villages, often through force. Non-combatants, including the elderly, bore the brunt of this requisitioning, losing their stored food and livestock, which would inevitably lead to starvation. They faced conscription of their able-bodied sons, further diminishing their support network. Mercenaries, often unpaid, were notorious for their brutality, plundering, raping, and killing civilians with impunity. An older person might witness unimaginable atrocities or be forced to flee their home as a refugee, a terrifying and disorienting ordeal for someone with limited mobility and resilience. The constant threat of invasion or raiding shaped daily life. Farmers had to be wary in their fields, villagers had to be vigilant, and everyone had to be prepared to abandon their homes at short notice. For the elderly, this meant a heightened sense of anxiety, a constant awareness that their security could be shattered at any moment. They might have lived through multiple such conflicts, witnessing the destruction of their homes, the loss of loved ones, and the profound social upheaval that followed. This accumulated trauma would weigh heavily, leading to chronic stress and a constant state of hypervigilance, further eroding their mental and physical well-being. The world was a place where one could be stripped of everything, including life itself, by the arbitrary whim of a passing warlord or a desperate bandit, a fate made all the more likely by the physical limitations that came with age. Number 4. The relentless assault of exposure and the grim reality of poor housing. The medieval senior faced a daily battle against the elements, a struggle made infinitely harder by the meager shelter that passed for housing. Homes in the medieval period, whether a peasant's hovel or a noble's castle, were often drafty, damp, and lacked the most basic protections against the extremes of weather. For an older person, whose body had a reduced capacity to regulate temperature and resist environmental stresses, this constant exposure led to chronic discomfort, debilitating illnesses, and a shortened lifespan. Peasant homes, typically built from wattle and daub or timber frames with thatched roofs, offered little insulation. Wattle and daub walls, made of interwoven branches, plastered with a mix of clay, straw, and dung, were prone to cracks and erosion, letting in drafts and moisture. Thatch roofs, while effective at shedding rain when well maintained, were also prone to leaks, especially after heavy storms or as they aged. A constant drip onto a sleeping mat or a living area meant damp clothes, damp bedding, and a pervasive chill. For an older person, this dampness would exacerbate conditions like arthritis, making joints stiff and painful, limiting movement and reducing their ability to perform daily tasks. Winter was a particularly brutal season. The only source of heat in most homes was a central hearth, often without a chimney, meaning smoke filled the interior before slowly dissipating through a hole in the roof or cracks in the walls. Breathing in this smoke day after day would lead to chronic respiratory problems, especially for older individuals whose lungs might already be compromised. Conditions like chronic bronchitis and emphysema would be common, leaving them short of breath and susceptible to infections. The heat from the fire was localized, leaving corners of the home frigid. An older person, less mobile, might be confined to a small area near the fire, while still battling drafts that crept under doors or through gaps in the walls. Nights were unimaginably cold. Without modern heating, temperatures inside a medieval home could drop to near freezing, especially during a severe winter. Layers of coarse woolen blankets and straw mattresses offered some protection, but inadequate insulation meant that body heat quickly escaped. An older person with slower circulation and a reduced ability to shiver effectively would be at high risk of hypothermia. Waking up chilled to the bone was a daily reality for months on end, contributing to a constant state of fatigue and vulnerability to illness. Conversely, summers could bring intense heat. Without air conditioning or effective ventilation, homes could become stifling hot, especially those with low ceilings and small windows. Dehydration and heat stroke were real dangers, particularly for the elderly who might not feel thirst as acutely or have limited access to clean, cool water. The stagnant, humid air inside a small dwelling would also create a breeding ground for pests and unpleasant odors. Sanitation within the home was virtually non-existent. There were no indoor toilets or running water. Waste was collected in chamber pots and then emptied outside, often into a ditch or directly into the street, contributing to the spread of disease. Floors were typically dirt, often covered with straw or rushes which were rarely cleaned, and became breeding grounds for fleas, lice, and other vermin. These pests could transmit diseases and cause constant itching and discomfort, disrupting sleep for an older person already struggling with aches and pains. The lack of proper washing facilities meant poor personal hygiene, further increasing the risk of skin infections and infestations. Even in grander houses and castles, conditions were far from comfortable. While stone walls offered more protection than wattle and daub, they were inherently cold and damp. Tapestries and rushes might have been used to reduce drafts and dampen sounds, but they also harbored dust, mites, and vermin. Open fireplaces in large halls provided some warmth, but the vast spaces meant much of the heat was lost. Latrines, often chutes leading directly outside into a moat or cesspit, were not designed for ease of use by the infirm. Drafts from these guard robes would permeate nearby chambers. Dampness was a constant issue in stone buildings. Rising damp from the ground, or moisture penetrating through the walls, would create a perpetually clammy atmosphere. This environment would encourage mold growth, contributing to respiratory issues and allergic reactions. Older individuals suffering from asthma or other lung conditions would find their symptoms greatly aggravated by these damp and moldy conditions. The very air they breathed in their homes could be a source of chronic illness. Beyond the home, daily life exposed seniors to the elements without reprieve. Working in the fields, traveling to the market, or simply fetching water from a well meant enduring rain, wind, sun, or snow without adequate protective clothing. Coarse wool or linen garments provided some warmth, but they were not waterproof. A soaking from a sudden downpour could lead to a severe chill, especially for an older person whose body took longer to warm up. Heavy cloaks were expensive and not universally available. The constant need to perform physical labor, even light tasks, in these harsh environments chipped away at an older person's health. Gathering firewood in the cold, carrying water, or tending to a small garden plot required exertion that became increasingly difficult and risky in extreme weather. A slip on icy ground, a fall from a ladder, or becoming lost in a snowstorm could have fatal consequences, especially for someone who lived alone and had no one to check on them. The lack of proper foot protection meant cold and wet feet were common, leading to frostbite or chilblains in severe winters, particularly damaging to the already delicate circulation of an older person. The environment itself, poorly mitigated by the structures they called home, was a silent but relentless antagonist, slowly eroding the health and well-being of medieval seniors. Number 5. The deep chill of social isolation and the peril of neglect. For many medieval seniors, reaching an advanced age brought not reverence, but a chilling descent into social isolation and the very real danger of neglect. While some communities fostered a sense of responsibility for their elders, this was far from universal, especially when resources dwindled or family ties frayed. For those without strong kinship networks or economic standing, old age could be a terrifying journey into utter destitution and loneliness. The family was the primary social safety net in the medieval world. A senior typically resided with their adult children, contributing what they could to the household, perhaps by caring for grandchildren, spinning wool, or offering advice. However, this arrangement depended heavily on the availability of adult children, their willingness to provide care, and the family's overall economic stability. High rates of child mortality meant that many parents outlived their offspring, leaving them without direct familial support in their later years. A plague outbreak could wipe out an entire younger generation, leaving a senior utterly alone. Economic hardship within a family could also strain these traditional support systems. If a family struggled to feed its own children, an elderly parent or grandparent, no longer able to contribute significantly to labor, could become a perceived burden. While overt cruelty might be rare, subtle forms of neglect, such as insufficient food portions, inadequate clothing, or a lack of attention, could slowly erode an older person's health and spirit. They might be relegated to a colder corner of the home, given less desirable food, or simply left alone for long periods. Widowhood was a particularly precarious state for older women. A widow, especially one without grown sons, might find herself dispossessed of land or property that was legally tied to her deceased husband. While dower rights existed in some regions ensuring a widow a portion of her husband's estate, these were not always honored or sufficient. Without a male protector or an heir to manage resources, a widow could quickly become impoverished. She might have to sell off her few possessions, rely on unreliable charity, or resort to begging. Her reduced physical strength would limit her ability to earn a living through manual labor, leaving her with few options. For seniors without any family, or those whose families had migrated or perished, the threat of complete destitution was immense. There was no widespread state-funded social welfare system. The church offered some alms and relief through monasteries and hospices, but these institutions were limited in capacity and often prioritized those deemed deserving poor. An old, infirm beggar might find occasional scraps, but rarely consistent nourishment or shelter. They might end up sleeping in barns, under bridges, or simply on the streets. Enduring the elements and the constant threat of crime, social isolation itself carried profound dangers. Human connection is vital for mental and physical well-being. A lonely senior might experience depression, cognitive decline, and a general loss of will to live. Without anyone to notice their decline, they might become ill and die alone, their passing unnoticed for days. They lacked the support of a careler to fetch water, prepare food, or simply offer comfort during illness. This isolation could be more debilitating than physical ailments, slowly eroding their very essence. The elderly, particularly those with physical or mental decline, might also be marginalized within their communities. Superstition was rife in the medieval period, and an older person exhibiting signs of dementia or unusual behavior might be viewed with suspicion, accused of witchcraft or demonic possession. This could lead to social ostracization, further deepening their isolation and potentially exposing them to persecution. The fear of being branded as something malevolent added another layer of anxiety to the vulnerabilities of old age. The structure of medieval society, with its focus on labor and contribution to the manor or household, meant that those who could no longer work efficiently lost their social standing. A peasant who could no longer farm, a craftsman who could no longer ply their trade, or a noble who could no longer manage their estates might experience a rapid decline in respect and influence. While some elders might retain their wisdom or storytelling abilities, these cultural contributions were not always enough to guarantee security in a harsh, practical world. The concept of retirement as a period of leisure and rest was practically non-existent. For the vast majority, work continued for as long as one could physically manage. For those who could no longer work, their value was diminished, and their survival depended entirely on the goodwill of others. This created immense pressure on the elderly, forcing them to push their bodies beyond their limits, often resulting in injury or collapse, just to maintain a fragile hold on their place in society. The daily struggle to remain relevant, productive, or simply not a burden was a profound psychological toll, layered upon all the physical dangers of their existence. The deep chill of being unwanted, of being left behind, was a constant, pervasive threat that for many medieval seniors was the ultimate cruelty of their final years.